let us, hello Tish, let us go and find the soul of Ripon. Beautiful place. Never been here before. Well, I've been here before, but I've never brought you here before in all those years. So, we're starting at King Street Bridge. So, we're starting our tour here on King Street Bridge over the River Snell here in Ripon. And Ripon is one of the smallest and pretty safest, you'd have to say, cities in the UK. I think it's the 4th or 5th smallest. It's tiny. Yet its city is kind of entwined with the threat of danger. And it's encapsulated here in the city arms, which we'll be touching upon. A bit of graffiti there, unfortunately, but you see the horn there. And this represents the famous Hornblowers that still carry out a nightly watch ceremony every night here in the square. And the watch has been set in Ripon every single night for well over 1,000 years. Now, the setting of the watch dates back more than 1,000 years to the year 866. And it was a troubled time then. The Vikings were kind of raiding up and down the east coast, occupying parts of the country. Obviously, we're not far from York, probably only about 25, 30 miles away from York. And of course, the Vikings did like to move by water. So you've got Viking problems, but you also got local thieves, rogues, vagabonds, taking advantage of this kind of unsettled situation, as people are wont to do in these circumstances. They say, what's in it for me? So King Alfred the Great had lost his father, his 3 elder brothers, fighting against the Vikings. But he was intent on victory and bringing stability back to the country. And in the year of 866, at the age of 37, he recaptured London from the intruders and set about touring the country, drawing up support and giving confidence back to the people. So he hit the road. And when he arrived in Ripon, he liked what he saw and decided to grant them a royal charter to the settlement, which is all it was at the time, just a settlement by the river. But the only thing he had to offer the people as a symbol of that charter in those simple times was a horn. So the original horn, known as the Charter Horn, was given to Ripon in the year 866. And it's the prize exhibit in the Civic Collection. Believe it or not, they've still got this horn. So this was presented to them by King Alfred the Great, and he who burnt the cakes back in the year of 866. And there it is, with the civic regalia. How impressive is that? Hello, Marlene, that we've still got this wonderful horn presented by King Alfred the Great over 1,000 years ago here in Ripon, over 1,100 years ago now. So that is their prize. And so obviously, as we go back over the bridge there, I'll just show you the that horn again. But I mean, that sort of, you can see why they're kind of ridiculously proud of their horn. So as I say, right in the centre, it's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah, of the regalia, here we see, is the horn. So that obviously commemorates not only the horn granted by Alfred the Great back in the year 886, but also the fact that it's blown in the market square every night and has been for 1,000 years. We're not going to see it today, unfortunately, it's not till 9 o'clock at night, but I've got some photos and obviously we'll talk about that. So yeah, so on the advice of the king, it was decided the people of Ripon should become more vigilant and should all be alert to the danger around them. These are dangerous times with the Vikings and raiders, as I say, ne'er-do-wells taking advantage of this kind of paranoia. And also men are out to war, left places undefended. So consequently, there were those who took advantage. So Alfred persuaded them they could lose their settlement and their good way of life and they were enjoying should the enemy kind of descend upon them. So it's all like be prepared, right? So that theme and concern would echo through Ripon for the centuries to come. And though the Vikings were gone, concerns about criminals and vagabonds persisted, though kind of attitudes varied significantly between the church and city authorities. And that's what I'm going to talk about really for the next kind of section really, is this idea about outsiders. So St John's, I'm glad it's a superb picture, thank you Catherine, hopefully better than Paris, just saying. This is St John's Chapel, and this is a chapel dedicated to St John the Baptist. It was built as a chapel of ease. What that means, a chapel of ease is basically whenever you've got a church that is built, but it sort of belongs to a bigger parish, as you might say. So of course, he isn't a kind of standalone parish, so it's a chapel of ease. And this was the chapel for St John's Almshouses. So Almshouses, which is just over there, we'll look at them in a minute. This was originally built as the hospital of St John. in the early 12th century by the Archbishop of York. So of course, being so close, there's lots and lots of links to York and Ripon. So in the Middle Ages, you've kind of got four main types of hospital. Those for lepers, those for the poor and the sick pilgrims, those for the poor and the infirm, and almshouses or bed houses. And this is one of those. So a bed or beddy houses. And this form of hospital often included the explicit instruction that brothers and sisters, who were called bed brothers and bed sisters, should pray daily for the souls of the house's founders and benefactors. And you might be, I've told you in York before, bedern means place of prayer. But did you know that the very thing you sleep on an evening, if you go to bed, that is, if you're not dirty stop outs, comes from place of prayer, bedden. Who knew that? I only found that out fairly recently, but I thought I've got to shoehorn that somewhere into a tour. And so there we go. So bed, bedden, place of sleep, place of prayer. It kind of works out, doesn't it? It makes an awful lot of sense when you kind of think about it, yeah? So bedden, in York, place of prayer. And so the kind of provision of charity forms an important strand of that kind of medieval, active Catholic Christian doctrine. And it kind of reflects attitudes towards the poor that would change dramatically in the centuries ahead. By the way, this and the Almshouses, it was all kind of rebuilt in the Victorian period, so it's in awfully good kind of condition, but it's perhaps not a surprise. It was rebuilt, so I'm not going to lie, but it's done a lovely job. So, you know, in that medieval period, you know, you've basically got an attitude towards the poor, the meek can inherit the earth and all that stuff, and it's very, very different to the attitudes that are going to come. So again, I don't want to sort of peering because people do live in these, but this is the rebuilt almshouses in the 19th century, these kind of rebuilt, but aren't they beautiful? This is such a cute little city. It is fabulous, you love it. This is a great tour and it's going to get better. I'm so pleased and proud. I've spent a lot of hours writing this tour, but I'm so thrilled with it and I hope you will be too. So let's just have a look at some flowers. There's always time to stop and smell the flowers. So let's just have a walk back down by the river. So we're going to walk along the river Skell, so S-K-E-L-L, Skell, like Skeldergate in York. It's a tribute of the River Ure, and the River Ure runs up the Yorkshire Dales. When we were in Hore, we were sort of looking at the River Ure. So that kind of runs down and then it joins up to the River Ouse and comes back into York. Everything is definitely history, yeah. And it's believed to come from the Old Norse meaning skalla, which means resounding, from which kind of swift and noisy course. So it's a fast-moving river. It's likely to have been the route that Alfred the Great took when he arrived here in the year of 866 to warn about the dangers of outsiders. Now in the Middle Ages it was known as Heaven Water, and that's presumably because very close here is Fountains Abbey. If you haven't, I'd love to take you to Fountains Abbey, but it's a National Trust, so almost certainly the answer could be no. But it is the wonderful kind of ruins of a Cistercian monastery, very close here, part of Studley Royal Park. We're going to talk about Studley Royal a little bit later on. So do have a look on YouTube, have a look at it. You know, it's stunning, it's beautiful. It's probably one of the most beautiful ruins anywhere in Britain. Very near to here, but I can't film there, sadly. But there's lots and lots of stuff available, so you can have a look. So you're doing Heaven Water. What's interesting about Ripon, and I don't know if Catherine's been, if you kind of notice, it's quite how many bridges there are here. I'm not going to say it's like Venice, because I think that's kind of overused, isn't it? You know, that kind of like Birmingham's like Venice and all this, that and the other. But there is a kind of profusion of kind of quaint bridges. They're not like the Newcastle bridges that Catherine might be familiar with, those kind of great bridges across the Tyne. But nonetheless, they don't have an awful lot of them here. There is 11 highly functional bridges connecting Ripon between north and south within a very short space, 2 or 3 miles. It's remarkable. This is Archer Bridge in front of them. So Catherine's been to Fountains Abbey. And this was constructed in 1811. I was really hoping there might be a John Carr Bridge here, because I'm a complete John Carr aficionado, and he was one of the great bridge builders of Yorkshire. But they haven't got a John Carr Bridge, but this is very similar in style. I think it's inspired by John Carr. And it replaced a much older bridge. So you can see here we've got a weir. And of course, weirs were sort of put into to speed up the movement and passage of water, to create turbulence. Very handy for washing, cleaning things. And lovely park. And so let's kind of have a walk on. And the internet signal is fantastic here as well. As if it's not enough to love about it, it's got a brilliant signal. So let's just take just a moment to have a look at the water. And hopefully you can hear that. In fact, rather than crossing the busy road, let's cross underneath. How cool is that? Love doing things like that. Reminds me a bit of Hebden Bridge. We'll have to go back there. That's definitely in the diary for this year. So if the signal drops for a minute, don't worry, we'll be back. We're just going under the tunnels here. Echo, 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 echo. Remember Echo? Those of you listening last week, if you haven't already tuned in, do go and check out the tour. We'll talk about Echo and Narcissus and Daffodils. The back of Thorpe Prebend House. We're going to be there in just a few minutes. But how charming is this? Yorkshire, as you know, has got it all. Not everywhere, always in reach or within 4 or 5G, but this place is. Isn't it fantastic? Can't believe it's taken so long to get here. All these years of live stream, first time in Ripon, but we're here now. So let's go over the bridge, and I'll just take a sip of water as we go over, and then we'll start talking. So we're on Bondgate Green. I'll just try and keep us out of the sun. We've got a glimpse there of the cathedral. We're going to have a nice long look at towards the end of the tour. I'll just refresh myself. And I hope you're all enjoying the sunshine. Isn't it so much nicer with blue skies? The sun's behind me, so I'm not going to kind of pan around fully. But how much nicer does everywhere just look with a bit of blue sky? It cheers you up, doesn't it? Wherever you are, if it's grey or misty or rain or even still snow on the ground, hopefully a little bit of sunshine and blue sky from North Yorkshire is going to have that positive, uplifting effect. And of course, the company as well. Hail fellows, well met. We are a merry band of pilgrims that are going to go and see the ins and outs of the ancient historic city, cathedral city of the Dales, that is known as Ripon. So we're coming into high St Agnes. There's a snowstorm today, mine. I'm so sorry to hear that, but I say hopefully a bit of sunshine here. We'll share that with you gladly, and hopefully it'll put a smiley face. So this is Thorpe Prebend House here, and it's one of Ripon's oldest buildings. We've had a little walk round, and I'll send this on to you. And it mainly dates to about kind of circa sort of 1700. But it's a great deal older than that. It was just kind of remodelled in the middle of the 17th century, 1600s, 1600s, we say 17th century, which about 1600s can be confusing, but kind of just remind that. And it was a prebendary house with the structure. So a prebendary house was basically something belonging to the church where one of the clerics would kind of live. Some famous residents in 1617, Mary Queen of Scots and her son, James IV of Scotland, who was later to become the King James I of England, would stay here. They stayed overnight. And it had been used, as I say, as accommodation for the cathedral clergy over the years. I'll just kind of take us round the side, because there's a kind of nice side. We can go back down to where we were looking from the other side of the river, actually. Isn't it lovely? So Thorpe Prebend House was handed over to the City Council in 1914 and became a city museum. It was closed for a while, but it's now back open again as a kind of heritage property. There's a lovely courtyard that unfortunately I kind of can't quite get into, but if I kind of give us a little spin around there, hopefully you can kind of see what lovely grounds it's got. So obviously this is the main aspect. So it was designed really to be seen kind of from the waterside rather than from the roadside. That's because it's more dramatic, but unfortunately we can't get in there. But what we can do is just bring you down to, by the way, named Thorpe, Anglo-Saxon, so I know you like these kind of things. So Thorpe means parish. So where I grew up, Bishop Thorpe, the parish of the bishop, because the Archbishop of York lived there. And Prebend means that a portion of the revenues of the church were granted to a member of the chapter as a stipend or paid. So that's what a Prebend means, is money that came from the cathedral was then used to pay the salary of a cleric. So there we are on the other side of the river, and little wooden outbuilding. Filming to the sun, which I don't really like to do, but isn't that a lovely spot? So obviously in its heyday, this kind of extension here wouldn't have been there. You'd have had a kind of an aspect of the house to the rear, which would have run right down to the waterside. So let's kind of go and see the building next door. If we get sort of sent away from here, we'll just do it graciously, because I did try and ask the people at the Thorpe Prebend Hall if it was okay to film in this bit, and they said it would probably be okay, but strictly speaking, we haven't got official permission, but I just want to show you, this is St Anne's Hospital. So St Anne's is another one of the hospitals. So again, we're talking about these places in the medieval period that were kind of reserved for the care of the elderly, the infirm. So this was the chapter of another medieval almshouse for the poor, the chapel rather. And it's believed to date from the 14th century, but the earliest kind of recorded mention is in 1438 when a chantry was added. So a chantry, in case you've sort of forgotten, you're not aware, was basically like establishing a place where people could pray, say masses for the dead. So invariably this was for the very wealthy, were chantries, and it was to say masses for the dead. The almshouse that's next door, I'll show you in a minute, was built for 16 women in 1869, but as a medieval place, it kind of replaced. But isn't it beautiful? So much. And again, so close together as well, which, like York, is an absolute delight. Prebend's Bridge in Durham, absolutely, yeah, exactly the same idea. So it's the Bridge of the Prebendary. Isn't that gorgeous? So medieval chapel in your garden, and say these almshouses from 1869 that we're not going to enter into, but there's lots of them. So I really kind of wanted to sort of set this kind of stall out early on and kind of show the Christian attitude towards kind of poverty and people that were sort of on their uppers, for want of a kind of better description, was essentially the church and society were there to help people rather than to judge them. There might be some criteria you'd have to meet, but nonetheless, it was, they didn't judge people. It wasn't that kind of vibe. It was much more, about how can we help people that are in genuine need. Isn't it glorious, this arch? Absolutely love this. It is definitely sort of. So we're kind of catching, again, glimpses of the sumptuous Ripon Cathedral, which we're going to explore later in the tour. We'll just, as and when we get glimpses, obviously high walls here. We've got St Agnes's Lodge. This is St Agnes Gate we're walking down, by the way. St Agnes, now if you remember, we did this in a tour near here, where we looked at some old ruins at Aislabie. And St Agnes was a very young girl who was met a horrible end. You can Google her. There's some young people around us that want to talk about what happened to her because she was only young. But she is absolutely a saint who is worth reading about. So this is St Agnes Lodge, which dates to the 17th century. It's a kind of interesting building, this, not least because of its round windows, with its 4 coins, they call them, on each one. So a coin, look at this for a fabulous external chimney at the end. Imagine the size of the fireplace in there. Absolutely enormous. So yes, this, again, dating from the 17th century and home to the vicar of Ripon Cathedral in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's got these circular windows, these coins. That's the bits onto all 4 corners, as you might say. The four keystones, rather. Very, very unusual. So it's a bit further away. Oh, the very young girl's gone now. So yes, St Agnes, basically, if you don't know, was she was basically a child that was kind of martyred. Now, I won't go to it, it's a bit of a downer story. I have told it before. So if you look out the story of Aislabie Abbey, you'll find it on there. But it's a sad story. But anyway, that's St Agnes. And my grandmother's named after, actually, interestingly. So that this house, this street, and my grandmother were named after a very important Catholic saint, venerated in the medieval period. So, aren't they gorgeous? So I'm sure Marlena is looking at these and deciding which, if not all, to bring into her burgeoning, cute English property empire. So far we've kind of talked about the charitable Christian attitudes to the poor in the medieval period and the attempt to alleviate the suffering of the poor in an otherwise kind of strictly hierarchical world. Now, it's kind of important to note that for kind of much of the medieval period, England's cities, especially nearby York, had enjoyed a sustained economic boom. So wealthy merchants were made kind of relentlessly aware it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so this provides a steady source of income to fund almshouses and the support of the poor. But throughout the 15th century, the English economy begins to contract. And by the final years of the century and the end of the medieval period, the economic crisis in York and elsewhere was acute. So it's perhaps not surprising then that as people felt less well off, their attitudes towards the poor begin to change. There was an increase in poverty-driven legislation, such as the Vagabonds and Beggars Acts of 1494 and 1495, which aimed to deal with the problem of the poor, not by aiding them, but by punishing them. So attitudes continued to harden as England moved from the Catholic faith to Protestantism. So the focus of charitable support came under pressure from new ideas about the deserving and the undeserving poor. And I think these ideas, it's worth spending a minute talking about them because I think they're with us still kind of to this day. So the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 codified this, and this law formed the basis of poor relief in England and Wales for the next 200 years. So part of the law's purpose was to codify types of poor into categories that separated the deserving from the undeserving poor. So the first group, the deserving poor, was split into adults who were known as the impotent poor. These are people who could not work due to sickness or disability. These were to be cared for in almshouses or a poorhouse, a few of which still existed in Ripon in 1601. Now, children in this group were known as the pauper children. They were the children of pauper parents or orphans, and were to become apprentices. So like, you know, Oliver Twist, they get brought in to become apprentices. So they learn a trade. So in essence, if you were sick, disabled or born into poverty, you deserve pity and a pittance of support. For the rest though, life was incredibly tough. The undeserving poor was split into two groups. The able-bodied poor, those who were physically able to work, which were set to work in a house of industry with the kind of necessary materials provided. And these came to be known as workhouses. And the second, the idle poor, the worst of the lot, including vagrants, were sent to a house of correction, or sometimes simply to prison. And it was around this kind of idle poor that most of the stigma and generalisation around the poor was created. And I think it's fair to say it still lingers to this day. People still characterise the poor, absolutely. So the city of Ripon, interestingly, has got three very interesting museums. They're all closed, can't go in them today, but I'm going to talk a bit about them, that sort of deal with this idea of how society deals with the poor. Offering a kind of, and if you visit, they offer a sort of fantastic, albeit chilling glimpse into the lives of those who felt to be the most unwelcome burden on society. So we're going to walk up towards the Police and Prison Museum. I'm going to talk about that as we kind of walk along. So as I say, I talk about this without kind of saying it's right or it's wrong, but simply how these ideas have lingered. And I think what's really interesting for those of you that are listening to this from the other side of the Atlantic, how these ideas and notions came with the settlers. So it isn't simply an Anglo perspective, you know, this is an Anglo-Protestant kind of perspective, do you know what I mean? That I think, you know, was kind of shot through into thinking about society and benefactors and so forth into the New World as well. So I think it is relevant not simply to the history of Ripon or Yorkshire, but really globally. So much of the West that moved to Protestant societies absorbed this thinking about the poor. So the Police and Prison Museum stands testament to centuries of legal and penal practices, and it's the place if you visit where you can see stories of offenders as wardens, judges, and kind of ordinary people sort of caught up in the wheels of justice. They converge, and it's a really good museum actually. It kind of offers a genuinely kind of nuanced, albeit kind of unsettling, look at the British justice system from its earliest days up to the Victorian era. So it really does kind of cover a lot of ground. But it's particularly in the kind of 19th century where the philosophy changes, not only towards the poor, but also towards prisoners, the incarcerated, and it shifts significantly. So earlier jails really were essentially kind of holding pens. The idea was simply to take people out of society, give society a well-earned break, as you might say, for an offender. But thereafter, it was that was the punishment, you're in prison. But by the Victorian era, there was a kind of growing belief that the power of solitude and hard labour to reform criminals. Thank you, Marlena. It does a lot of work. It doesn't kind of fall out of the sky, but thank you for noting. So this idea about reforming criminals, but doing it through pretty brutal fashion, as you might say. So the Prison Museum, which we'll be sort of arriving at in a minute or two, sort of showcase this transition. So solitary confinement, for instance. I'm just going to cross over to this beautiful medieval wall. This wall dates from about 1505, and it surrounds the old deanery, the abbot's house. Isn't it beautiful? The house behind it is quite modern, sadly, but the wall is very, very early 16th century. So that's nice. So solitary confinement, for instance, wasn't merely punishment. It was seen as an opportunity for introspection and, of course, spiritual redemption. Because this is the ultimate prize, isn't it? It's to get people to turn back, to confess their sins in court, but not to seek atonement through kind of the confessional box, because that's the old Catholic way. Now you have to repay your duty to society, not to God. Very, very different. Very, very different idea. So prisoners were kept in isolation for extended periods. The idea was to give them plenty of time to think about what it is that they've done. Their only companions being their thoughts, but of course, as well, an ever-present Bible. So that was the idea. And of course, that kind of relying on you actually having light to be able to read and so forth. But the museum does a really kind of cool job showing replica uniforms, tools, and personal effects. It's just here. So you see here, look, we've got the crest of power and the chains of incarceration. So I'll give you now a little snapshot of the prison museum. Sadly, we can't go in, but I'm going to hear how nice I'm being about them. I'm hoping that one day they'll say, yeah, come on in and see what to offer. So you can't really see too much in there, but we'll go to the courtyard. So there's lots of actors kind of dress up in here as well. So this is fantastic. So here we are. It's the old police box and the prison exercise yard. So inside you've kind of got replica uniforms, tools, personal effects that kind of paint a vivid picture of this isolated existence. And Victorian prisons were particularly designed with very sort of specific philosophies in mind. Often kind of deterrence, isolation and reform. I'm just going to put the camera down while I take a drink. The kind of thick walls, look how thick the walls, you know, we are. And high windows were not just practical features. They kind of represented the kind of severance from the outside world of the authority of the state and the bleakness of a life without freedom. So this is the kind of the idea that they're trying to get. And they came up with particularly kind of soul-destroying methods of breaking people. There was a notorious form of hard labour. There's the treadwheel, designed to be anything other than productively useful, but as a punitive exercise. I don't know if you know about the kind of treadmill, but this museum's got a fantastic depiction of it. I'll show you a picture, and then we'll just talk about it. So here we are. So this is a treadmill, and if you look carefully, what you can kind of see is at the bottom of these like booths, almost like voting booths. You see there's like steps. This is a wheel. And basically, the idea is you simply, like a treadmill, like you do as exercise now, wouldn't you? But in those days, you were on it for like 8 hours a day. In silence, you couldn't see anything other than the wall directly in front of you. You weren't allowed to talk. So imagine how destroying this would be for people, you know? Body and soul, the physical toll it would kind of take upon you, doing this for 8 hours a day. And of course, the psychological impact as well. And it's kind of a real stark reminder that punishment, exactly at the gym, 8 hours a day, every day. But there's no music, there's no company, and there is certainly no videos or anything like that, so I'll just get rid of that. I do that, don't I? It's pretty bleak. Lovely old prison door here. So it's just kind of stark reminder that prison wasn't just about deprivation of liberty. It was about breaking the spirit through monotonous, arduous toil. And of course, punishment could be physical as well. We've also got the, let me just find it for you, inside here, the birching bench. So you can see there a bench that people are being strapped to for incredibly painful punishments. Terrible food as well, Marlon, absolutely. So, you know, this was all about kind of breaking the spirit. You know, this is, you know, probably the most spirit-crushing, though, of the elements, I would say, would be just the sheer lack of variety in prison. Let's kind of walk on. But I'd love to come back here, so I'm saying all sorts of nice things and hoping they'll go, Come and do a tour inside, that'd be great, wouldn't it? But to kind of deter idleness, which is the worst vice in the eyes of many. And this is kind of a real Protestant idea about the Protestant work ethic, isn't it? You know, the idleness is the worst. So let's think about the day of a prisoner, a day in life of a prisoner inside those halls. So imagine waking before dawn to the clang of a bell. A day of relentless march of chores, silence and isolation. A typical day for a prisoner in a Victorian institution like Ripon was highly regimented. I'm just going to cross over. Designed to break the spirit and to instill discipline through routine and deprivation. So thank you, don't worry. So you've been woken at 6 for you basically you wash, you've got to hygiene obviously. And that's the kind of the start of your regimented day. 6:30, a sparse, monotonous fare for breakfast, gruel, bread. It's sustenance over enjoyment. There's certainly kind of, what have we got for you today to enjoy? None of that. It's simply keep you alive. 7 a.m. you're at the chapel for religious service, instructions and moral reform. Always mandatory, always silent, of course. And from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m, so to lunchtime, you've got hard labour. On the treadwheel, oakum picking, which is pulling apart ropes, which absolutely was very, very painful on the fingers, particularly arthritic older people. And also sort of breaking rocks. It was kind of physically demanding, soul-destroying, pointless work for the most part. And at 12 p.m, lunchtime, you have dinner, be a slightly more substantial meal, but again, usually eaten in silence. And then back from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m, you're back to hard industrial work, a continuation of labour or skills training possibly. Might be doing things like shoemaking, weaving or tailoring, if available. Not to make them better people, but so the prison could pay for the staff to look after you. So earn your keep, as you might say in the prison. This is cute, this road. At 5 p.m, you'd have supper, similar to breakfast, gruel, very plain, just there to keep you alive. And at 6 p.m, you've got solitary time to look forward to. Reflection, reading, the Bible, of course, the only thing you're actually allowed to read, or the religious texts. Or you could be mending, or simply living in isolation. Then at 8 p.m, it's lights out, and that's the end of your day. And then it starts again the following day. So that was kind of life in prison. Not a lot to look forward to. So for the rest of the evening, of course, darkness, silence, cold till morning. And this kind of relentless cycle was designed not only as a punishment, but as a kind of mechanism for moral improvement, but also social control. Let's be honest, this was about taking the poor and breaking them and rebuilding them in such a way they could no longer be helpful. Thank you, Natalie, I'm glad you're enjoying it. So the idea was that through hard work, silence and religious instruction, prisoners would reflect upon their crimes and emerge reformed. That's the idea. In reality, the kind of psychological toll was such that existence, the reality was people were broken, leading to mental health issues and desperation. Many, by the time they came out, were so broken physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, they couldn't work, so they then go on to begging, or perhaps more sort of petty crime. Making work really sort of next to impossible. So it's a very self-defeating system, as in prison is now. And I apologise for those that kind of are staunch believers in prison. I think prison has its place, but I'm not convinced it's a place of reform and rehabilitation for a lot of people. I think it's a dangerous jungle of survival for a lot of people who probably come out with whatever problems they had when they went in, and we've added a few kind of along the way. But nonetheless, if you're completely broken by prison, not to worry, because you could then be moved on to the next dumping ground, which of course was the workhouse, the house of correction. So don't worry, don't imagine for a second that was the end of the ordeal. It was just really the start of a whole new chapter of being crapped on by the authorities. And here in Ripon, you've got another fabulous museum portraying life in the workhouse. So just kind of coming into view now is the Ripon Workhouse Museum. And the workhouse was established in the late 18th century. This front bit rebuilt in 1854 as a kind of crucial institution for the relief of poverty in the area, reflecting broader social attitudes towards the poor in Britain. So the workhouse in Ripon has its roots, dating back to 1776. So important date for those in the USA. When it's established as All Hallows Hall, and this site was repurposed to accommodate the growing need for poor relief in the community. So prior to this workhouse being built, this specialist workhouse, there was two workhouses here in Ripon in the 17th century, one within the Archbishop's Manor House. Now the Ripon Workhouse was designed to be a place of last resort for the homeless and the destitute. It was a grim environment where inmates faced strict rules and hard labour. And by the early 19th century, the workhouse was home to around 33 inmates, including men, women and children, many of whom were unable to find work to support themselves. 11 men, 11 boys, 9 women and 2 girls. Only one of the men was not able-bodied at 68, so only one didn't work. But those who were spent 8 hours a day breaking stones to mend roads. So the workhouse system in Britain evolved significantly due to various legislative acts. The Poor Law Amendment of 1834, which aimed to reform the poor relief system. Now the new law effectively banned what they called outdoor relief. And outdoor relief basically meant that you were able to go to your parish, your local church authority, and say, I'm a widow, I've got children to feed, I need some money. It stopped all that. You could no longer go to the parish. What happened is you had to go into the workhouse. And this was the absolutely last thing people wanted to do. It was a terrible place to be in, but it was also socially about as bad as it could possibly kind of get. So they made it as awful as possible to put people off. But if you really needed relief, you had to go inside the workhouse. So they built this new workhouse here, so you see it erected in 1854 to meet new standards, in other words, to cope with the demand, because they took away basically social security payments and so you got to go to the workhouse. The Ripon Poor Law Union was formed to oversee this in 1852. But by the first decades of the 20th century, the growth of the socialist movements, the kind of devastating impact of the First World War, it was inevitable the poor law system couldn't survive in its kind of current state. The beginnings of what would become the welfare state began to emerge. And in 1929, the workhouse were formally abolished, although this one continued onwards. But I've got a couple of photos from inside, which is kind of unusual. So the first one from around the turn of the century, we can see here the ladies there in their aprons. You can see their age. They're all kind of getting on a bit, and you can see very, very kind of basic sort of furnishings. The second picture was taken about 30 years later, so we'll get rid of that one, bring this one in. And this was nominally after it had closed, but in reality it simply continued on. If you look at the face of the women there, they're not really thrilled, are they, to be in the picture, having the picture taken. So it continued to be used as a home for the destitute and didn't finally close here until 1974. So that picture was taken in 1934. So whatever you can see there basically continued on unchanged for another 40 years. So despite what we might think is social policy, in reality, for a lot of people, this is still what it was looking like well into the 20th century. And I think it just kind of shows that, whatever we think now is what's happened with kind of benefits and so forth, it was needed. People were suffering from destitution, poverty, and terrible degradation, and suffering because of their poverty. So I think something needed to change, something did change, and the worry is now we're sliding back. And I'm not trying to make this a political tour, but that's what I suppose I am. But I'm also saying contrast those medieval attitudes towards the poor to the later attitudes of the poor. And I think, whatever we might think about the Middle Ages, the kind of period of sort of superstition and plague and all these terrible things that happened, is their attitudes towards the poor were damn sight more enlightened, I think they were in the Victorian age and probably as we are now. So this museum provides a really good insight into the lives of inmates and the historical context of poverty relief in Britain. But let's kind of move on. It's well worth a visit. If you're in this area, it is well worth a visit. But in the case I'm talking about the Depression, which of course we associate with the USA, but of course because of the Wall Street crash, it impacted right the way across the world. So we know about impoverishment, we know about depression, we know about kind of suffering. And whilst people will argue we don't get the same degree of suffering today as we did back then, we would hope that we've learnt a little about just basic human dignity particularly those who aren't in a position to work, aren't well enough, and we can perhaps just lose this judgment of who deserves our help and who doesn't, because I think that deep down, most people, given the chance, would support themselves, look after themselves and their family. They wouldn't look to others to provide for them, but if they do and they need that help, we shouldn't be judging them, we should be looking and saying, how is it we can help? But there we go. Maybe I did get political there, but I make no apologies. But yeah, pretty grim. Being in the workhouse, and to such my grandma, you know, obviously she died, well, you know, 25, 30 years ago, but she would kind of talk about, you know, as a child, just what it was like, you know, hearing about families going into the workhouse. You know, it was the absolute social disgrace. It was a thing that people would do anything to kind of avoid. So these kind of workhouse places, they stand as kind of historical significant sites, reflecting the kind of complexities of social welfare and the treatment of the poor throughout British history. But let us leave that behind and come to the Market Square, which is really rather lovely. Now, Robinson Crusoe's author, Danny Defoe, described Ripon Market Square as the finest, most beautiful square that is to be seen of its kind in England, which is rather nice, isn't it? That was in his book, The Tour Throughout the Whole Island of Great Britain, written between 1724 and 1726. It goes on to say, in the middle of it stands a curious column of stone, imitating the obelisks of the ancient Egyptians. I'm going to see that in a minute. And the city's obelisk is one of those important structures, hence it's kind of grade 1 listed, and perhaps after the cathedral, the most distinctive. But it's more than that, it's a firm place in kind of architectural history, because it's the first freestanding obelisk anywhere in the country. It was put up at the very, very beginning of the 18th century as part of a scheme to improve Ripon. And as the historian Thomas Gent wrote when chronicling in the year 1702, John Aislabie, Esquire, and that year in the marketplace was paved and adorned with an obelisk, a freestone 82 feet high, all of which cost £564, 11 shillings and 9 pence. Look at that, sky, sound great. So let's have a picture of the sponsor, because he's an interesting character. John Aislabie, his name appears here because he was the mayor of Ripon at the time. Let's get him and his edifice, which he really insisted on. He was absolutely insistent. Others disagreed, didn't really like the idea of this, but he wanted it. He was the mayor of Ripon, so he got his own way, and he's been the MP from 1695. And so shortly after the arrival of the obelisk in 1702, he begins to ascend to the heights of government. The Ripon MP, he became an ally of the Earl of Sunderland, who in effect became the Prime Minister in 1718. So Sunderland was appointed Aislabie as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the Ripon MP becomes the Chancellor, the guy in charge of the finances of the country. And when in 1719 the South Sea Company proposed a deal whereby it would take over the national debt in exchange for government bonds, Aislabie was a very strong supporter of the scheme and negotiated the contract. He piloted the bill through the House of Commons to make it law. Now, the South Sea Company had been built on high expectations which it could never fulfil, and it collapsed in August of 1720. And a lot of people lost an awful lot of money. It was the Wall Street crash of its day. People had invested in this company believing it was too big to fail. Remember those days? Oh, it's too big to fail. Well, it wasn't. And it found that Aislabie had been given £20,000 of company stock in exchange for his promotion of the scheme. He was forced to resign as the Exchequer Chancellor in January of 1721. And given he was quite clearly guilty of a criminal act, he was tried and imprisoned. But it's fair to say that this man, who in the Commons was described as being guilty of the most notorious, dangerous and infamous corruption, he was actually expelled from the House of Commons, removed from the Privy Council. He was imprisoned, though, in the house in the Tower of London, which I dare say was probably a wee bit more comfortable than it was in Ripon Prison. So let's get rid of him because he's annoying me. And I think you can probably see where I'm getting at here. It's a bit one rule for the rich and another for the poor. No treadmills, no birchings, lived in comfort, let out after a few years, and he then spent the rest of his life tending to his gardens at the Sudley Royal Estate. Meanwhile, his son took over as the MP. So what the people of Ripon thought of this, I don't know. But they generally had a pretty low opinion of crooks. And long before the National Police Force was created, they had an effective protection against crime in the form of the Wakeman. So the Wakeman was a man who would stay awake and patrol the settlement and surrounding areas from dusk until dawn. He kept a watchful eye out for any approaching enemy or troublemakers while the rest of the people slept safely in their beds. And the idea of this had first come from King Alfred the Great in 886, who'd strongly counselled for vigilance. It was further decided the Wakeman should put the charter horn presented by King Alfred to good use. He would sound it at the four corners of the market cross, where we are walking on now, each evening at 9 p.m. to let the people know that the watch was set and he was now on patrol. So by the early 18th century, when the market square was taking shape that we see today, the Wakeman, whose role had merged with that of mayor, had constables to patrol the streets. And they also had the right to levy a rate on houses according to the number of outside doors. So 4p a year for 2 doors, 2p a year for 1 door. And so actually, because it was a good business, they rather resented the police force being created. And there was quite a big tussle over here, because in effect, the watchman, the Wakeman, had become the mayor, and the mayor had a nice income. And of course, the mayor was, you guessed it, always the property owner, the guy of Sudley Royal. So one of Aislabie's lots. But to this day, every night of the year without fail, a horn is blown at the four corners of the obelisk, not the old one, of course, set the watch, and a final one outside the house, the mayor, which you're looking at now. So I'll just show you an image of the Hornblowers. Where are we? Here we go. 4 of them. So they're outside, I'll photograph a second, a few years later, outside the town hall. Aren't they looking resplendent with their horns? So they're not holding there. I don't think any of them are holding the ancient one. I think there's 5 horns. So obviously the priceless one is not pictured there. I don't think so. But just before we have a look at the town hall, I want to show you this, which is really cool. Little act of kindness here by a lady by the name of Sarah Carter, who was the daughter of a Lord Mayor, who in 1911 purchased this wonderful cabmen's shelter to give the men, the cabmen, who were still horse and carriage, hackney carriage people. Lovely row, by the way, as well here of, isn't that fantastic? There's a picture for you, Catherine. The 4 telephone box of the cabmen's shelter. First, thank you, fantastic. So the guys waiting in the market square for the dignitaries were given somewhere to kind of shelter. Isn't that cute? Some protection against the elements. Isn't that beautiful? So data from 1911. It's the cabmen's shelter of Ripon. So the town hall was completed in 1799, see what it was now, by Elizabeth Allenson, the granddaughter of the disgraced former MP, John Aislabie. But it seems that stigma had not been long lasting. Her father had been MP for Ripon, so consequently, when he was jailed in the Tower of London, the seat passed to his son, and his son held the seat for 60 years, from 1721, and he'd also inherited the Sudley Royal Estate from his father. He then passed it on to Elizabeth Allenson, who marries the next MP of the city. So it's fair to say politics was a family business here in Ripon. And the town hall was commissioned to hold the city treasure, especially the horn granted by Alfred the Great. Now, when Elizabeth Allenson died, the estate ownership and the right political control of the borough fell to her niece, Elizabeth Lawrence. And Mrs. Lawrence maintained a firm control over the borough and handpicked the Tory councillors to run the council according to her wishes. However, in 1832, the Great Reform Act resulted in the beginnings of modern democracy. And rather ungratefully, the new voters of Ripon chose to elect 12 Liberal councillors to run the borough. And Mrs. Lawrence was so appalled, she refused to allow them to meet in the town hall. So new premises had to be found down Kirkgate. We're going to head down in a minute. But just before we leave the town hall, I want to draw your attention up to the top here. And I'll just give you a little bit of zoom. And it says, except ye Lord keep ye city, ye Wakeman waketh in vain. And the inscription reflects Psalm 127, which is translated as, unless the Lord keeps the city, the watchman waketh, but in vain. So in other words, it's sort of it's not just the Wakeman, it's the Lord as well. So it was added in 1886, celebrating 1,000 years of the granting of the Charter by Alfred the Great. And, there we go. So it's a call to God to aid the city in keeping outsiders at bay. But it was kind of rather late, as it was in God's name that one of the biggest outsiders in Victorian society had already lived in the city for a number of years and captured some of the delightfully strange details of the city's cathedral in one of the most celebrated novels of all time. So as we go down Kirkgate, we're going to talk about none other than Charles Ludwig Dodgson, which some of you may be aware went by the name of Lewis Carroll, and he was the author of Alice in Wonderland. So he'd been born Charles Dodgson in Derbyshire, as the oldest son to 9 siblings, and his father was the archdeacon in Richmond, which we've been to, Ripon Cathedral. And in 1852, when Dodgson was 20, his father Charles Sr. became canon of Ripon Cathedral, where the children were forced to live with him for 13 weeks of the year. So Lewis Carroll spent 3 months a year here, basically, in his early 20s. For those who haven't seen a picture of Lewis Carroll, here he is as a young man. You might have seen him sort of slightly later, but this is him as a young man. He's born into privilege and respectability in northern conservative circles, but he's a kind of outsider by temperament. He's shy, he stammers, he's a kind of deeply private guy who goes on to be an Oxford mathematician. But he was known for his extreme shyness, reclusive habits, and for his severe stutter. So it's perhaps not surprising that when his brother took lodgings in Kirkgate, round about where we are here now, I don't exactly know where, but in this area here, he and Carroll spent a good deal of time in these lodgings, rather than sort of mixing with the kind of society of kind of Ripon, as you might say. Now, there's something of a feeling of going down a rabbit hole as we walk down Kirkgate, the kind of the winding and sloping street of delightful independent shops that takes us from, let's get rid of Lewis Carroll, we'll keep on talking about him, do hope you enjoy this one, takes us from the 18th century square to the medieval cathedral with its ancient crypt. So Lewis Carroll spent a great deal of time in the cathedral, which was built between 1160 and 1547. We're going to walk down there now. And for a time kind of comparator, the early English style west front that you're just about to see coming into view was completed in the year 1220. And that's the year that work on York Minster began. So it's a good deal older than York Minster, but it didn't have anything like the same pulling power as York Minster, and that's arguably true today as well. So here it's coming through. So there's a west view coming in. So cathedral time now. And that was sort of something that Lewis Carroll's father, Canon Dodgson, was keen to address, was this kind of idea of getting people through the door. So he decided to introduce daily services in the cathedral to draw the crowds. And the move proved ultimately unsuccessful. But it did mean that his dutiful son, Lewis Carroll, spent a great deal of time in the cathedral. It was already a favourite haunt of this shy, stammering, withdrawn man who spent many hours in the cathedral immersed in its architecture, lost in his imagination. Now, with the introduction of the daily evening services, he was to spend a great deal longer. So it was a lot more time in the cathedral. And it seemed to have formed in his head an inspiration for what many believe to be the finest novel for children ever published, Alice in Wonderland. As the son of the canon, it's perhaps not surprising that he took to sitting in an area known as the altar, in the area near the altar rather, known as the Misericords. Now, I don't know if anybody has heard of the Misericords. I'd be very impressed if you have a look at this lovely old gateway bridge. Isn't that beautiful? Survived medieval. So prayers in the medieval church happened 8 times a day. So if you were a monk or you were an orderly, you're going to church 8 times a day. And prayers were done standing up with your hands sort of uplifted towards heaven. So the old or the infirm could use crutches, or as time went on, a misericordia literally meant a pity of the heart. And it was to create an act of mercy. And what it was for those that required, some help, it was like a prop, and it was constructed that the seat, like a cinema seat, could flip up. But when it's flipped up, so you're standing for prayer, there's like a little shelf that sticks out. However, the underside sometimes of this small shelf was carved, allowing the user to kind of lean against it, slightly reducing their discomfort. So let me show you a picture of a misericorde so you can understand what I'm talking about. So this is what it looks like. So if you have a look at that, can you see that if you look at the centre of it, you can see there's a little sort of platform sticking out. And so basically, that's for your bum. So if you're elderly, you need something to lean on, that's what you could do through these kind of long interval church services. You could lean it. But they do these carvings underneath. And because the carvings were out of sight, on the flip side, they tended to be mostly non-religious subjects and depict everyday scenes of animals, monsters, and strange beasts indeed. Let's get rid of this. And one such seat in Ripon Cathedral, the mayor's stall, so where the mayor will go, depicts a griffin and a rabbit. Maybe we see where I'm going with this. The low relief sculpture shows a vicious griffin chasing a rabbit. So let's bring this up and I'll show you. This is a wooden sculpture on one of these misericord seats inside the cathedral. So let me find that for you.
Excuse me, sir.
There it is. I'm sorry, I'm live, I'm chatting in a minute.
I'm on your live.
Oh yeah, fantastic, hi.
Hello.
Do say hello.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Hello, live.
Hey.
How are you guys?
That's great, thank you. Just shows, doesn't it, that you can always be found. So if you look there, you've got the griffin and you've got the rabbit. So the rabbit is kind of moments from leaping into the burrow. So Carroll liked to entertain children with fantastical stories they made up on the spot. Now during a picnic in July of 1862, Dodgson made up a story about a girl named Alice, ostensibly 8-year-old Alice Liddell, the daughter of a fellow Oxford Don who chases a rabbit into a hole in the ground, ends up having a wild adventure full of strange and baffling creatures. He claimed it came to him from nowhere, even when in the case of Alice in Wonderland, that fiction is very strange indeed. So central to the narrative of Alice in Wonderland is the idea of a rabbit disappearing down the hole. And in this carving, there's 3 openings to the burrow, if you look, and where one rabbit can be seen to be leaping into the tunnel in one of the small pictures. And the griffin's claw touches the rabbit, which leaves us kind of unsure how this moment ends. Does the griffin lose its grip as the rabbit escapes down the hole? Does the rabbit give it into the griffin's strength? Or is it Alice, now shrunken, being controlled by a creature under the Queen's orders, just like the carved figure? So, here with that, we'll come back to the... So Carroll's own griffin appeared in chapters 9 to 11 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, adding a similar kind of sense of mystery and tension, in quoting, "They came very soon upon a griffin lying fast asleep in the sun. 'Up, lazy thing,' said the Queen, 'and take this young lady to see the mock turtle and to hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions I've ordered.' And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after it as the savage Queen, so she waited. Now, hidden amongst the arches of the cathedral, we have a depiction of the Queen. So hard to see who's got a gilt here. A striking figure of a lady standing atop a bodiless cat, which we'll look at in a minute. The lady smiles as she stands crowned and armed. Her unsheathed sword gleamed where her hand presses again with solemn devotion against her heart, the Queen of Hearts, yeah? She rises above all in her pulpit, regal and immovable, perhaps oblivious to the wide-eyed cat crouched in the shadows below her feet. The scene invites an immediate comparison to the Queen of Hearts, a figure defined by her overwhelming presence and fierce, unquestioned authority. The stone carved into the pulpit underscores the kind of nature of her rule, a reign shaped not by mercy, but by force. She's cast as a warrior, and in the world of Alice's Adventures of Wonderland, unmistakably as a tyrant. In the book, the Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head!" The bodiless cat, whose wide-eyed features show the personality of Alice's Cheshire Cat. And the combination of the two together, so let me show you a picture of the cat. So in case you're thinking, can't we see much of the cat on here? This is at her feet. So the combination of the two together make an unmistakable connection to young Dodgson's inspiration. So the Cheshire Cat's wild, knowing grin, so unmistakably his, has long captivated readers. The term Cheshire Cat dates back to the 18th century, and it referred to famously kind of well-fed dairy cats of the Cheshire region in North of England. Yet Carroll's own creation may owe something to the cathedral carving. A bodiless, cat-like face pointing out from beneath the Queen's skirts, tongue lolling in manic delight. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the Cheshire Cat belongs to the Duchess, though he answers to no one. He slips through the world like a phantom trickster, materialising whenever Alice least expects it. If you haven't read Alice in Wonderland, stop what you're doing and go read it, it's brilliant. If you think you know the story, look at it again, because there's so much in there. And of course, he dissolves just as suddenly, leaving nothing but an eerie, lingering smile. His kind of remarks are brief and cryptic, unsettlingly wise, each delivered with a calm that borders on mockery. "We're all mad here," he tells Alice. His presence is defined by cunning wit, mischief, and a talent for riddling conversation. In one of the story's most striking moments, the Queen of Hearts orders his execution, yet he escapes her wrath by vanishing everything but his grin, leaving the executioner with nothing to behead. And if this was not enough, there's one more kind of strange inspiration we found among the carvings, the image of the blemmies. So in medieval lore, the blemmies were strange, formidable beings, mystical ambassadors from another realm, shapes that were human, but their faces set deep in their chests, and they had no head upon their shoulders. Their presence is legend, and it's eerie and commanding. And through the link between these creatures and Lewis Carroll is delicate, right? So, I'm not going to say this is definitive, but it's interesting. There's undeniably something there, something present. So let me just show you a picture of the blemmy. So again, we're going into the wood carvings inside the cathedral here. Hopefully, again, we'll take you inside one day. So here we are. So you see a man with no head, but his face is in his chest, right? So for generations, scholars have suggested that Dodgson's Humpty Dumpty, Mr. Nobody and Somebody echo the carved blemmies in the stall in Ripon Cathedral. Yet the influence may run deeper still. The very idea of blemmies, humanoid forms twisted just out of place, seems to ripple throughout Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Across Alice's journey, she encounters a parade of distorted figures who guide, confuse and challenge her. The rotund and inseparable Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the grotesquely affectionate Duchess, the imperious Queen of Hearts, each one is recognisably human, yet exaggerated or warped or whimsically wrong. Their bodies and behaviours reflect a world where familiar becomes unsettlingly strange. As Alice ventures deeper, Wonderland's dreamland logic teeters between almost plausible and utterly impossible, drawing her into a realm where reason dissolves into fantasy. Why sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast, the White Queen tells Alice. So if you think that a lot of this is perhaps a bit far-fetched, a bit overreaching it is ultimately a book, I suppose it's set in Oxford, isn't it? There's a couple more interesting links that you might want to consider. Links between Carroll and Ripon. So the friendship between Henry Liddell and Charles Dodgson was based around them both being Oxford University academics. But Henry, the father of Alice Liddell, who was the girl for whom the story was told, and she encouraged Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson, to write the story down for her. And he was kind of obsessed with this child, and now there's obviously question marks about the nature of that relationship, but I'm not going to go into that here. Her father, Henry Liddell, had spent a number of miserable years at school here in Ripon. And when finally Alice in Wonderland was being prepared for publication, Dodgson chose the name Lewis Carroll. And by the way, in case you're interested in how he came to that name, it's from Latin. His name is Charles Ludwig, and he basically translated that into Latin, which is Lewis Carroll, reversed it, Carroll Lewis rather, reversed it, that's why his name, because he wants to keep separate basically his work as an academic don in Oxford and that of a kind of fantastical children's author. And he decided to do the illustrations of Alice in this mad world himself. And despite being a talented artist, he was not satisfied with the results. So he brought in Sir John Tenniel to bring his story to life. So searching for an image to base Alice upon, Henry Liddell showed Carroll a photo of a girl by the name of Mary Badcock. Now, Mary Badcock was the daughter of Reverend Badcock. And Reverend Badcock had been the headmaster of the school in Ripon that was attended by Henry Liddell. So the actual father of Alice also found, Alice Liddell that is, found the image upon which the illustrations of Alice were based. Tenniel was granted permission to use the image of this otherwise unknown girl from Ripon. And she became famous the world over, of course, as Alice. So this is based on photographs of Mary Badcock, who was the daughter of the headmaster of Henry Liddell, who was the father of Alice Liddell, on whom this story was based. So I find it kind of delightfully ironic that this city that to this day celebrates its watchful eye over outsiders should have given birth to this strange world where logic bends, proportions shift, and the familiar becomes unsettlingly strange. It seems to be precisely the sort of thing that Alfred the Great had warned them about 1,000 years earlier. And just to finish off our tour and our time together here in Ripon, it's a little bit over time, but only a few minutes, I wanted to show you the locations, we'll get rid of Alice, of where it was that Charles Dodgson, otherwise known as Lewis Carroll, stayed, where his father lived for 3 months a year throughout the first half of his 20s. And it was here at the old deanery. So how close is that? So this is where the Dodgson family were located, in the old hall. I don't know how much light you can see now, but it will mention on the plaque there the link with Charles Dodgson and Grace Slick, yeah, the White Rabbit. The link there. So yeah, it's got it all, hasn't it, Ripon? Beautiful buildings, absolutely delightful cathedral, fascinating history, a horn that dates back 1,000 years, watchmen that are still blowing their horn every evening at 9 p.m. Shame we can't still be here, but that's another 3 hours away from now. And of course this link with Alice in Wonderland that many of you might not have even been aware of beforehand. So I do hope that you've enjoyed that that was value for money for you for the last hour or so of your time. And I thank you for